We are in process of developing a whole series of techniques which will enable the controlling oligarchy to get people actually to love their servitude. People can be made to enjoy a state of affairs which, by any decent standard, they ought not to enjoy.
Remember, the issue is not just about gun control. It's about control. Now, here's your host, Larry Pratt.
And welcome to this edition of Live Fire on the Gun Owners News Hour. Today we're going to talk about an interesting topic, has interested me for years. It's been a doorway that people supporting gun control, gun restrictions, gun banning have constantly been trying to use to convince us that there ought to be more and more reasons for denying people their right to keep and bear arms. I'm referring specifically to mental illness and the fact that many times even the use of the term mental illness may be misleading. It may sound like this something scientific, something chemical, and my guest today is going to address that very notion, as she has for quite some time. Dr. Linda Lagemann has been a private counselor, a psychologist, and gave up the practice in order to spend more time pointing to the problems inherent in some of the psychiatric claims that have been used to broaden the tools available for people who want to take away our right to keep and bear arms. So, Dr. Lagemann, thank you so much for being with us today. Appreciate you.
Thank you very much. Really, I appreciate being here, and I'm very eager to get information to the people.
Well, I'm so glad that you have devoted yourself to this, because it's one of the major ways that anti-Second Amendment folks have pursued or used to try to restrict firearms ownership. And the law actually doesn't permit them to use psychiatric language unless there's been, or shouldn't. And this is the problem with the law. It's unnecessarily vague. Somebody may be a danger to self or others. Well, if that's really the case, we have a thing called due process. Let's lug it into court and have it out with the lawyers and the experts and let the jury decide. Well, that often doesn't happen, does it? No, it doesn't. I mean, there are many problems. We kind of have to back up, as you indicated in your intro, to the definition of mental illness and then look at who's behind these definitions and how they're getting used. But cutting to the chase, the bottom line is when you're looking at the cause of violence, the correct target is the psychiatric drugs. And we will spend some time kind of going over how that is the case, but I want to just put that out at the start here, that is the correct target. And we get distracted and people are kind of provoked into arguing, gun control, Second Amendment right, because they know, the American Psychiatric Association knows that is a divisive issue in this country, and so they push on that. And then, of course, the other thing is the calls for more mental health treatment. So kind of backing up to lay the foundation about the very idea of mental illness. I think most people probably don't know. I know many people in the mental health field don't even know that these diagnoses change over time. They are literally voted on. There's work groups, and they get together and they argue and they yell and then they take a vote. Gee, just like we diagnose measles, right?
Exactly, right. I mean, you can't conceive of this. I mean, I think this is what's really staggering is how successful this has been and how much influence, control, authority, expert status the American Psychiatric Association has when it's not based on any science at all. So it's literally voted on. They like PTSD, that came into being in 1980. There was always the recognition of reactions to trauma, shell shock, battle fatigue. But in 1980, they called it a mental disorder. And I also want to be clear that people do have very real mental and emotional struggles. I spent 23 years in private practice helping people with that. But
and with all due respect, I might point out you had chosen to do so behind enemy lines in San Francisco, where some of the country believes that the whole place is batty.
Yes. That's right. That is right. So they're real struggles. They're not medical conditions. There is absolutely no scientific evidence to justify using the word disorder or disease. That is just language that is used that facilitates marketing. Because if you call something a disorder or a disease, then it automatically kind of shapes people's thinking and makes them think, oh, this needs a medication. This is a medical issue.
Right.
So that's the first, we can fill that in a bit. But when there's violence, some kind of one of these killing sprees, immediately you have a couple things happen. One, you will have people say in the media, well, it was because of their mental illness. That's why this happened. And, the system failed them. They didn't get enough treatment. Because, by the way, these people are all in treatment. They're all seeing psychiatrists. I'm not aware of any of these killing sprees where the person was not on a psychiatric drug or in the withdrawal phase of one.
Well, now, in the world of real science, when there's a 100% association,
right,
this is present when that happens. Isn't it reasonable to conclude that must be a contributing factor?
Definitely. Now, and what you'll have people say is that it's, you could have somebody else say, well, the 100% correlation is that they have the mental illness. But let's look at this, because never, and I'm sure this would be on front page if it ever occurred, never have I heard a single one of these cases where the person was in treatment because they had homicidal fantasies, and that's what was trying to be treated. That's never the case. You hear these things like the Navy Yard shooter, Fort Hood shooter. These are people who come into contact with a psychiatrist for the usual things, like let's say they're talking the
depression.
Ivan Lopez, the mother died, or people depression, the loss of job, stress readjusting. Naturally, let's say a veteran coming back from war, or even just not even having seen combat, but just the training and the away from home and family.
Let me comment on that, because I have a little personal experience. Not that I've been to war, but I know a fellow that has. And he has been in combat, and he allowed that he had PTSD. He would get up in the middle of the night. I'm not sure it was every night, but when he would get up with this startled frame of mind, he would grab for his pistol and clear the room, a term for those that are not familiar that just means he would sweep the room with his eyes following the muzzle of his gun to see who was there. And when he was satisfied that just another bad dream, he'd put the pistol down and go back to sleep. He's over that.
That's right.
And to my knowledge, he didn't take any medications. He's a Christian fellow, and he realized that, I got to stop doing this.
Right. That's a great example, because one, it shows this is a normal reaction. That kind of hypervigilance and exactly what he was doing. The entire scenario you just laid out.
So I picked a good example, normal. It looks like. As soon as I said it, it was out. But I didn't mean to say mental disorder, much less mental illness. A mental problem. That I think would be the less clinical. Dr. Lagemann, you're pointing out that we discuss these things: emotional distress, grieving, depression. Those are normal human reactions to the problems that we face in life.
Completely. And, back to, this example we were talking about just before the break that you brought up, this veteran and that kind of hypervigilance and sweeping the room. So all a normal reaction to an abnormal situation that he was in. And it does just take time. It takes some time. It takes talking to other veterans who've experienced the same thing. The worst thing you can do is take that person and say, you have a mental disorder. You're broken. Something is wrong with your brain that you're reacting this way. Oh, we're so sorry that war has broken you. We're going to put you on drugs to fix you.
Yeah, you can't fix your own broken arm, so I guess my analogy, how does a person fix a broken personality?
Right. And once you do that, a couple things happen, but you've taken the control away from the person, you've pathologized them, meaning you've made them sick where they weren't. They're normal. This is a normal reaction. And then once you drug the person, now you really can't get your equilibrium back because you're being given mind-altering drugs. That's exactly, psychiatric drugs, psychotropic, it means that psyche, mind, and then tropic means turning. That's where you get the phrase mind-altering. They alter your brain.
Thank you for the definition. I appreciate that.
Yeah, and they alter it in substantial ways. If you do nothing with PTSD, these kinds of normal reactions, stress, there's some people who are actually dropping the D because that's again where you brought up, it's calling it a disorder, just PTS, post-traumatic stress. That's right, stress, normal. You come out of a trauma, of course you're going to be stressed. It doesn't mean that all of a sudden you have a brain disorder or a mental illness.
I'm stressed after driving in city traffic.
Yeah, that's right, right. Back to, kind of how this normally plays out when you have one of these violent episodes. So somebody is in treatment for, like, let's say this guy could have ended up in treatment because he's waking up like that. Let's say somebody tells him, a well-meaning person says, yeah, you really should go talk to somebody. All right, well, that somebody is usually a psychiatrist in the VA system, and the most available treatment they have, they don't have time to talk, they drug people. So then he gets put on.
By the way, that is a thumbnail sketch of socialized medicine. No time. The system is overloaded. That's every description I've ever read of the British medical system, which is a single-payer, government-run system. No time. And so if we're talking about really helping people, that's the last way in the world.
It is. And it causes more problems that then overwhelm the system further, because once you start drugging the person, then they have adverse reactions, which are part of the drugging. And the combination of adverse reactions cause violence, cause suicide. Like, let's take the most commonly prescribed drug, the SSRI antidepressants. That means serotonin selective reuptake inhibitor. Fancy name, but basically what it means is normally you have one cell in the brain that releases serotonin. It's just one of the brain chemicals. And then another cell has a receptor site that receives it, and it goes there and it fires on that site, and then it gets reabsorbed and goes back through the system. That's the normal. The SSRI antidepressants block that reabsorption. So it releases, the one cell releases the serotonin, and it goes to that receptor site, and it fires, and it fires, and it fires, and it keeps on firing. It does not reabsorb. That's a very artificial situation that's been created in the brain. The brain will adjust. It will try to get its equilibrium back, and how it does that is it will start shutting down production of serotonin, its own normal production, because it says, whoa, we have an elevated level of serotonin because it keeps firing. Let's stop production. And if the drug is still taken, the next way that the brain tries to regain normal is to shut down some of those receptor sites, because it says, we don't need these. We have too many receptor sites. We're getting too much serotonin. This is why the drugs stop working. Like, some people do experience an initial positive reaction to the antidepressants, and they feel better. But very quickly, the brain adjusts, and then it stops working. And then
now, if they have that initial positive reaction, is that the result of the chemistry involved, or is that a placebo effect?
Well, that's a really good question, because there's a lot that's a placebo effect. Even of the cherry-picked studies that were given to the FDA, so we're talking about the drug companies picked the best possible representation they could give to the APA to get a drug approved, to the FDA, sorry. And of those, somebody did an entire meta-analysis, meaning a study of all the studies, and found that of those cherry-picked studies, 80% of the benefit came from placebo.
Wow.
So, yeah, and this is of the top studies.
And there may have been other studies that would have been 90, 100%, perhaps, from placebo.
Well, there are other studies that where they show how much damage it's doing, and those get concealed. They know these things. They have studies like Eli Lilly before Prozac, which was the first blockbuster drug. Before Prozac was approved, they knew that it increased suicide sixfold, actually. Prozac increases suicide compared with the placebo. If you take 1,000 people and you give them 1,000 depressed people, so you take people who are depressed, randomly assign them to two groups. The placebo group getting a sugar pill, there were 2 suicides in that group. The group given Prozac, there were 12 suicides. So they know this.
And of a normal, a randomly selected group from the population that didn't have any mental problems that they were dealing with, what would be the normal suicide rate, or was it that too?
I don't know the rate, but I know it's an increase. This study in particular I'm talking about was with depressed people. It was that next level of clinical controlled trial.
So theoretically, the rest of the population would be lower.
You would think, but I'm thinking of there's a book called Side Effect Death, and it's written by a guy named John Verapen. He is the former head of Eli Lilly for Sweden, and he wrote that book. It exposes all of the marketing, all of the tricks they use, all the payouts, and he says, he's writing kind of as a confessional because he's haunted by some suicides that happened early in his career. Young 24-year-old girl or 19-year-old girl who was in the study, the first phase where they're not depressed. Actually, they screen out anybody who's depressed because they're just trying to test the drug in terms of its overall safety. And so they use college students. Say, volunteer for the study, we'll give you some money. And this girl, after being a week on Prozac, hung herself at the lab.
Ouch.
Yeah, ouch. That's one of the things that he said haunts him, and that's why he wrote the book.
Well, God bless him for doing that. Welcome back. We're doing Live Fire on the Gun Owners News Hour. My guest today is Dr. Linda Lagemann, who has nearly a quarter of a century in a private practice dealing with folks that come in feeling the blues and all other descriptions of personality problems. I'm trying to make sure I cleanse my vocabulary from these faux medical terms. Well, they're real medical terms, but they don't, as you've been arguing, Dr. Lagemann, they don't apply to the people with these problems. And in fact, you were able to see people get better without ever once prescribing a drug.
Oh, absolutely. And, absolutely. I taught 9 years plus. I'm still on the faculty at UCSF, University of California, San Francisco, and taught courses on how to help people without drugs. So, the drugs, there's this medical model and language used that tries to give it some legitimacy, but none of these have panned out. And we're in the middle right now of a huge drugging of the population. 1 in 4 Americans now is on a psychiatric drug. At least one. 1 in 4 is on at least one psychiatric drug.
That's pretty scary, actually.
It is very scary because this is how you control a population, is you get everybody drugged. And the children, we've got more and more kids on psychiatric drugs. These drugs, the antidepressants, ththese things, they're disabling. They're disabling the population. Going back, looking at the history of psychiatry, there was the miracle of prefrontal lobotomies. There was the miracle of Thorazine, the first antipsychotic. Do you know that since 1955, when they came out with the antipsychotic, Thorazine, and it was touted as a miracle. It's like, they're going to cure like schizophrenia and people hearing voices and things. Since 1955, the rate, not the total numbers because our population has increased, but the rate of people on mental illness, permanent disability for psychotic disorders has gone up 4-fold. So thank you, Thorazine, the miracle of Thorazine. These psychiatric drugs actually worsen and create the very conditions that they are named to heal.
And the idea of a frontal lobotomy, folks, that's an operation. They open up your noggin and cut out part of your inside there. That sounds like a witch doctor.
It does, and I don't want to get too heavy on everybody, but that still occurs. Lobotomies still occur today. You would be surprised, I know. And so it is like a witch doctor. These are all, it's like bloodletting. But psychiatry has no science. It's not based on science. And so you still have, it's basically still in that stage, even though it's using medications that make it seem like there's science, and there's all this science language around it, but it's all experimental, and it is doing just as much damage as the old stuff. When you have an increase in suicide and homicide, violent episodes, medical things, there's a whole list of adverse reactions. But going back to the violence, because this is the thing where...
And by the way, let me just, as a P.S., you and I discussed this at another time. But I've talked to one psychiatrist, even a GOA member, so he's obviously very supportive, and I'm sure he would be aware of the dangers of using a medical diagnosis instead of due process to deprive somebody of their right to keep and bear arms. But he was quite convincing when I talked to him that why these medicines do help, that you see people stabilize and they can then leave their lives normally, and I think that needs to be addressed. You've already touched on it, but I want to hit that again.
Yeah, well, definitely. First, there's a tremendous amount of misinformation, false information in the public and the professional area. There are journal articles in the professional journals, the medical journals, that are written by the pharmaceutical industry, actually, where they've paid some expert, Harvard psychiatrist guy, to put his name on it, but it's written actually by the pharmaceutical company and gets published then as a study in a medical journal. You have continuing medical education seminars where the attendees do not know that the expert they're listening to, giving them the talk, is paid by a pharmaceutical company to be weaving in there and pushing a particular drug. So there's tremendous amounts of misinformation. And then in the public, of course, we have direct-to-consumer advertising. We're one of only 2 countries in the entire world that allow that, where we allow pharmaceutical companies to market, to make TV commercials, print ads, telling us about mental disorders and psychiatric drugs.
I hardly ever watch television, but I think I've seen an ad for Ambien, and I guess that's supposed to take your stress away and make everything go butterflies and chirping birds and things like that. Okay.
Yeah, there are a bunch of these. There's Abilify, which it's the typical commercial says, if your antidepressant isn't working for you, add Abilify. It never tells you that Abilify is an antipsychotic, the most powerful drug. One of the adverse reactions of the antipsychotic medications and the ADHD drugs, by the way, given to children, is it shrinks brain tissue.
Oh, what could be wrong with that?
Yeah.
It's the same as a lobotomy.
Yeah. So so you're mentioning this doc who's also a GOA member and being very convincing, and I think people are well-meaning, but they don't have. If you're not actually studying this, you're not seeing the aggregate of data, the big picture.
I'm sure he would have had no idea that there are people being paid big bucks. In some of the info that you were nice enough to share with me, this one chap, Joseph Biederman, chief of the program in pediatric psychopharmacology, Massachusetts General Hospital, that'd be the same town as Harvard, $1.6 million in consulting fees from drug makers in 8 years.
That's right.
Hey, that's not bad.
No, that's not bad. And there's so many payouts. There's one study, let's see, that showed they looked at Minnesota. I think it was Minnesota, where the drug companies paid out, let's see, they increased their payments. Yeah, it was Minnesota. So they 6-fold increase in drug company payments to psychiatrists to be pushing antipsychotics, actually, for children. And because this is a big area, it's a huge new market now, is all the drugging of children, and especially the antipsychotics. Left to their own devices, the antipsychotics have a very small market. There aren't that many schizophrenics in the country. But if you start pushing it for children with ADHD, for added to people's antidepressant, then now you've broadened it to cover everybody.
Now, the person that is diagnosed schizophrenic, would they not be the same as other people with mental problems, that they can be challenged to get a grip on themselves and to...
Yes.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. And in fact, there are a lot of studies, but I'll just tell you one, because it was a long-term study, like an 8-year study by the World Health Organization. They actually did it twice. They replicated the study. They looked at developing countries and developed countries. So the developed countries they looked at were the U.S., UK, Japan, Ireland. There's some others in there. And then compared to Nigeria, Colombia, India. And they looked at people diagnosed with schizophrenia in these countries and how they did over time with the different treatments or lack of treatment. And at the end of the follow-up periods, they did 2-year follow-up, 4-year, 5-year, up to 8 years. The people in the countries where they were not given medication, now obviously there are going to be other factors because you're looking at cultural differences and community support and things like that, but those are relevant also. But the key thing is no drugs. In Nigeria and Colombia and India, 64% of the people who had been diagnosed schizophrenic were asymptomatic, had no symptoms at the end of a couple of years, and they had, quote, exceptionally good social outcomes.
That sounds like a pretty good treatment plan.
Do nothing.
Welcome back to this last segment of today's edition of Live Fire on the Gun Owners News Hour. My guest today is Dr. Linda Lagemann. She's had almost a quarter century dealing with private patients who were struggling with personal problems. And it sounds to me like you had a pretty good track record, and people were able to get better without your writing a prescription.
Yes. And, and the reason I closed my practice, true, I had like 23 years. I had a full private practice in downtown San Francisco. I'm in the financial district. And, I started seeing more and more all these regular people coming in on psychiatric drugs already or thinking they needed to be. And finally there was a tipping point for me, and I wondered what is going on that would make people that are so capable think that they had a mental disorder and needed to be on drugs. And it's like starts with, the commercials that have really influenced our whole culture and how we look at our struggles and being human. So, I closed that, and I got involved with the other thing that I wanted to mention here is the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. I'm an advisor for the Citizens Commission on Human Rights. There's tons of information there. I direct people to the website cchr.org for Citizens Commission on Human Rights. And for the international one, cchrint.org. There's lots of information there, award-winning documentaries that you can watch for free on the website, or you can order them too, and a drug database that's like the largest compilation of all of the reports to the FDA of adverse reactions, so people can, get informed about different drugs. So I closed that because I just felt like I needed to have more impact than the one-to-one person in my office, because the drug companies, the American Psychiatric Association, they are not messing around. They are extremely effective, and it is literally, disabling the population. And I really want to do whatever I can.
Let me circle back. That's going to have political consequences in a general way, and you've mentioned it. It's going to end up making people dependent on that doctor initially, but it's going to do something to their way of thinking that I'm not able to control my future. I have to see the doctor for this, and a dependency mentality, I'm suspecting, flows out of this. And then, of course, the other impact is one of direct concern to gun owners. I give you one example, Doctor. I read about something a few months ago where they have now passed their sort of SAFE Act like Connecticut's, and they've got a registration list of people's firearms, which they've had for years, and now they're bouncing against medical records, which I suspect in many cases they've gotten from Obamacare and other databases that have been made computer accessible by law, and so they start bouncing those names around. And here's a guy that took a mild antidepressant some 25 years ago. Evidently he recovered, was no longer being medicated, but because of that medical record showing up and then matching him as a gun owner, knock, knock, knock. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is scary. And, all of this is occurring because of the authority right now that the psychiatrist has in our culture. And this is a thing where people can make a difference. I mean, one, people can stop being consumers, of the psychiatric drugs. I mean, with working with a doc who knows how to do this and can safely get somebody off. But people need to stop being consumers, spread the word, let others know it's a grand fraud that is disabling people. And, get information, spread information, tell your school and your school board that you don't want any mental health screening of your kids. Where does the government get off doing mental health screening of our kids? The pointing the finger everywhere, but there's a lot of things that are going on to distract people from what's the actual cause of some of these problems. And like I said, the psychiatric drugs, that even the FDA warnings, you can't get an FDA warning, a black box warning, without showing causation. There's some language. It's like a reasonable certainty of causation.
Am I correct that they're trying to medicate sometimes because a child is hyperactive? Is that actually going on?
That they're medicating them?
Yeah.
Yeah, completely.
Now,
completely.
If a 5-year-old is hyperactive, particularly if he's a boy, isn't that the end of the diagnosis? Oh, he's a kid.
No, absolutely. Do you
maybe he needs a spanking.
There's so much about this because you would be shocked. I mean, I have lots of data on from IMS Health. It's the largest database of this stuff, of health records. The numbers of kids, the younger and younger and younger that are being drugged. 1 in 70 preschoolers right now is on a psychiatric drug. Preschoolers.
I would think a spanking would do a lot less damage, especially long-term, than one of these drugs.
Well, these drugs are altering the brain and on developing brains. But, you're absolutely right. It's regular childhood. The other thing that's a problem is usually you're talking about the kids that are more creative, more active, questioning authority, the ones who have independence. These are more likely to be targeted as defiant. There's a diagnosis, oppositional defiant disorder. There's the ADHD that's used. So you're taking your best minds and drugging them to stop point. Them. Yes.
That'll level us, and that'll, again,
That's right.
make us more of a majority dependency society.
It's completely about control dependency, because when you tell somebody that they have a mental disorder, it's a chemical imbalance, which is a made-up thing. You're telling them that they have no responsibility. This is totally out of their control. So they are dependent on you or something outside themselves to fix it. So, we have, what I would like people to get out of this is, really like when there's, the next shooting or some kind of killing spree, like the Isla Vista killing spree in UC Santa Barbara out right there. The first 3 people that guy, Elliot Rodger, killed, he killed with a knife. Mm-hmm. 4 of the people that he injured, he ran over with his car. They're killing sprees. It's not a gun issue. You've got to look at what would cause a person to do this. And we have to not let the thing be distracted by pointing fingers at either gun ownership or at saying, they needed more mental health treatment. It's like he was getting it. All of them have been getting that, quote, mental health treatment that is known to increase these very problems.
And you've kept track of that. I've tried to, but I imagine you could point to those mass shooters as people who had been either at the time or sometime not long ago getting these drugs.
Yeah, there's a very short, it's less than 15 minutes, I can't remember how long it is, but there's a short video on the CCHR website that is called Prescription for Violence. And it does exactly that. It goes through. It shows this killing, this drug, this killing, this drug, this killing, this drug. It shows all of them.
Excellent. That will certainly go into our repertoire. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah.
I was going to say arsenal, but I knew that would not be well received.
I want to give the punchline to the study I was talking about when we went to a commercial, just so people know the answer to it. This World Health Organization study.
Good.
I mentioned that 64% of the ones in the developing countries, Nigeria, were fine. In the U.S. and the U.K., where we have all our fancy pharmaceuticals, it was the opposite. 65% were actively psychotic on the antipsychotics. And the World Health Organization concluded by saying that living in a developed country was a strong predictor that a person with schizophrenia would never fully recover.
Because they'll stay on the drug.
They'll stay on the drug, and it will keep them psychotic. Just like antidepressants create chronic depression, anti-anxiety drugs create a worsening anxiety. All of these alter the normal brain in ways that cause the very things that they say they're going to help. Yep.
Pretty stunning. So if somebody is on one of these drugs, there are physicians that can help them leave it safely. Yeah,
just a quick one is there's a book by Peter Bregan, that's called Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal, and that would be very helpful to people to know.
Well, that's great. Dr. Lagemann, thank you so much for sharing your long experience with us.
Thank you.
Do you sometimes feel a bit blah? No matter what you do, just blah. You may have tripolar disorder. Don't worry, we've got a drug for that. Side effects may include anxiety, delusions, hallucinations, emotional numbing, uncontrollable shaking, weight gain, mania, psychosis, suicidal tendencies, homicidal ideation, panic attacks, and paranoia.
From the age of 10, docs pumped mind-altering meds into Adam Lanza. Pretty much every school shooter in the past decade was on prescription drugs. On antidepressants, kids are 10 times more likely to get violent. Suicides are even more widespread.
You take a mortal man, you put him on psychotropics, have him play violent video games, and join the military. Starts to hear voices. He gets through 2 checkpoints because he has a top secret security clearance. Shoots a bunch of people. So now America has to turn its guns in. Because Dianne Feinstein has the moral high ground. Just like Nazi Germany, they'll take our guns. Because Obama loves the children, turn in your guns right now. Acting like a robot.
Politicians forcing Pharmageddon on Americans.
How about Prozac? You know the number one, oh, that's the big sponsor, isn't it? Or that whole class of drugs.
Let me ask you a question.
Oh, whoa, got to cut that off, don't you? Don't want to talk about the U.S. number one cause of death is suicide now because they give people suicide mass murder pills.
Calm down.
Your answer is give more money to the psychiatrists and psychologists to put more crazy people on drugs that make them kill people, Pierce.
Walking, eating, driving, or engaging in other activities while asleep without remembering it the next day have been reported. Abnormal behaviors may include aggressiveness, agitation, hallucinations, or confusion. In depressed patients, worsening of depression, including risk of suicide, may occur. Alcohol may increase these risks.
When a mother chops her kids up with a cleaver because she's on serotonin...
Tell me why I'm wrong.
Why don't you want to get rid of the drugs? Because they're half your sponsors?
Suicide and malformations the mainstream media won't report because for every dollar drug firms spend on research, they hand out 19 times more to media on commercials. Big-Pharma shills an astonishing $100 billion on ads to brainwash you into buying. Top spender is Pfizer with this notorious antidepressant Zoloft. Mainstream media gratefully pockets the fortune, and who cares about the viewers?
The industry is responsible to Wall Street.
America's number one cause of unnatural death now is suicide.
Alex,
not automobile accident, not cancer, not...
You accuse me of attacking the Second Amendment of the Constitution.
I want to get people off pills that the insert says will make you commit suicide and kill people.
Alex, let's get about to the Second Amendment.
I want to blame the real culprit. Suicide pills. Mass murder pills.
Okay. In your son's situation, I would recommend that we go with medication. We can start him off with these. Side effects include mania, aggression, hostility, psychosis, homicidal ideation. At least 8 of the recent school shooters have taken these. Let's see. We've got Springfield, Oregon school shootings, the Red Lake, Minnesota school murders, and, the Columbine massacre. But it's really up to you.
Have you been diagnosed with depression and struggle with sadness?
Maybe you're scared of being criticized.
Ask your doctor about Effects or Exile. Ask your doctor about Symbol.
Talk to your doctor about Zoloft.
So talk to your healthcare professional.
Your doctor today. Your doctor. Tell your doctor. Contact your doctor immediately. Talk with your doctor.
Every day, psychotropic drugs cause serious adverse reactions. And while psychiatrists and drug companies fully understand the dangers of the drugs they sell, their unsuspecting customers are left to suffer the consequences.
Everything became worse. Each mood swing was worse.
He would have chronic headaches, chronic, nausea, not feeling good.
She was very agitated, very, very jumpy.
She was having horrible hallucinations. Her personality was disintegrating.
Once he started on that drug, the cloud just stayed over him and stayed over him and stayed over him. It got darker and darker.
He thought there wasn't anything worth living to kill himself. That was not Matthew. That was the drugs.
At least I would like to have said, I love you. I didn't get a chance to do that.
In addition to crippling scores of people daily, every month, psychiatric drugs kill an estimated 3,000. But the human devastation would never have gotten this high if psychiatrists hadn't worked hand in hand with drug companies to promote their drugs to doctors throughout the world. Today, 70% of all psychiatric drugs are prescribed by general physicians. And how is this accomplished? Marketing.
It's about creating a good story that uses science, that convinces a physician to think about writing a prescription.
This is not science. This is incredibly effective marketing. It has nothing to do with science.
They use what I call statistical contortionism. Basically just skew the numbers, make everything look fantastic. You hide the bad numbers.
They're learning every trick in the book. They're evolving into efficient marketing machines, and it's working.
There's definitely an unholy alliance between psychiatry and pharmaceutical sales. That's a marriage made in heaven.
They're like conjoined twins. They're joined at the wallet.
And with 374 mental disorders filling psychiatry's diagnostic manual, and more on the way, business is booming. Pharmaceutical companies have expanded their roster of psychotropic drugs from 44 in 1966 to 174 today. The top 5 psychotropic drugs combined gross more money than the gross national product of each of over half the countries on Earth. Altogether, the psychiatric industry rakes in $1/3 of $1 trillion a year. How could this have happened? It's a tale of deception that may be difficult to believe, but fatal to ignore.